Do you know that not a single word is written in the Gospels about the last days of the Virgin Mary's life? Absolutely nothing. The 4 canonical texts that tell us about the birth of Jesus, his teachings, crucifixion, and resurrection maintain complete silence about what happened to his mother after the events at Golgotha. And this is despite Mary being one of the most revered figures in Christianity, a woman prayed to by billions of people worldwide. How did it happen that the story of her death is shrouded in such mystery? Why has the Church argued for centuries about whether she even died in the ordinary sense of the word? And what really happened to Mary after her son ascended to heaven? Today, we will uncover this amazing story, which is far from known to all believers. We will journey from the last mentions of Mary in the New Testament to the ancient traditions passed down by word of mouth among the first Christians. We will learn why the Eastern and Western churches call the same holiday associated with her departure by different names. And most importantly, we will try to understand what really happened to the woman who gave life to the one whom Christians consider the Son of God. This story is full of unexpected twists. It features ancient manuscripts that the Church did not include in the Bible, archaeological finds, and traditions preserved in the most remote corners of the Christian world. Some of these details may surprise you, and some may even shock you, because the truth about Mary's life and death turns out to be much more complex and interesting than the simple stories we heard in childhood. Ready to learn what is really known about the last days of the Virgin Mary? Then, get comfortable, because this will be a fascinating journey into the depths of history and faith. Let's start with what we know for sure. The last time Mary is mentioned in the New Testament is in the book of Acts of the Apostles. This happens right after the ascension of Jesus. The apostles gathered in Jerusalem in an upper room of a house, and there among them was Mary, along with other women and the brothers of Jesus. They were all together in prayer. And that's it. After that, silence. Not a word more about the mother of Jesus in the canonical texts. Imagine this situation. A woman who experienced the incredible. An angel appeared to her and announced that she would bear the Messiah. She carried a child, not knowing if those around her would believe her, if Joseph would reject her. She gave birth in a stable, fled to Egypt, saving the infant from Herod. She raised her son, watched him grow up, begin his ministry. She saw him rejected, mocked, and finally, she stood at the cross, watching her son die a painful death. This is an incredible life story, full of drama and pain. And after all this, after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, they simply stop mentioning her. Why? There are several versions. The first, the evangelists and the author of Acts, wrote their texts with a specific purpose: to tell about Jesus, his teachings, the establishment of the early church. Mary in this context was important as the mother of Christ, but after his ascension, the focus shifted to the apostles and the spread of the faith. The second version, Mary indeed lived a quiet, modest life after her son's death, not playing a public role in the early church. And the third, most interesting one, the story of her life and death was passed down orally, in communities, and was not written into the canonical texts, precisely because it was considered too sacred, too special for simple narration. Be that as it may, the lack of information in the Bible led to the emergence of many other texts, so-called Apocrypha, which tried to fill this gap. The most famous of these is a text called the Dormition of Mary, or Dormitio Mariae in Latin. There are several versions of this text written in different languages: Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic. They all appeared around the 4th or 5th century, that is, 300 to 400 years after Mary's earthly life. But the authors of these texts claimed they were recording ancient traditions that had been passed down orally in the church from the earliest times. What did these texts tell? According to most versions, after Jesus' ascension, Mary remained living in Jerusalem. According to some traditions, she lived in the house of the Apostle John, to whom Jesus from the cross had entrusted the care of his mother. Mary spent her days in prayer, visiting holy places associated with her son's life. She was surrounded by the respect and love of the first Christians who saw in her a living connection to Christ. Years passed. According to different versions, Mary was between 50 and 70 years old. No one names the exact age. And then one day, while she was praying, the Archangel Gabriel appeared to her. The same angel who had once brought her the news that she would become the mother of the Savior. This time he brought another message, that soon she would leave this world and be united with her son. In some versions, Gabriel even gave her a palm branch from paradise as a sign of her imminent transition. Mary was not afraid. On the contrary, she rejoiced, for she would finally see her son again. But she had one request. She wanted to say goodbye to the apostles. Imagine, these people had been her family in recent years. They shared with her the memory of Jesus. They together created the first church. And so, according to tradition, a miracle occurred. The apostles, who by that time had dispersed to different parts of the world preaching the gospel, were suddenly miraculously transported to Jerusalem. Peter from Rome, John from Ephesus, Thomas from India. All of them found themselves at Mary's bedside in an instant. Can you imagine this scene? Old friends who hadn't seen each other for years suddenly meet in one room. At first, they are in shock. How did they get here? But then they understand. It's divine intervention so they could be with Mary in her final hours. They surround her, pray with her, remember Jesus. And in some versions of the text it is said that even the Apostle Paul was present, although he had never met Jesus during his lifetime. This brings us to the main question: what happened next? How exactly did Mary die? And here, the discrepancies in the traditions begin, which ultimately led to serious theological disputes. Let's look into this in detail, because this is the key to understanding why the story of Mary's death is so important to the Christian tradition. According to most ancient texts, Mary's death was not ordinary. At the moment when she was about to breathe her last, Jesus Christ himself entered the room, surrounded by angels. In some versions, it is said that the entire room was filled with an incredible light, so bright that the apostles could barely look at it. Jesus approached his mother, took her soul into his hands. Yes, that's exactly how it's described in the texts, as if the soul were something material, and ascended with it to heaven. Mary's body, however, remained lying on the bed. The apostles, still in a state of reverent awe from what they had just witnessed, prepared the body for burial. They wrapped it in a shroud, anointed it with incense, as was customary. Then they carried the body to the Garden of Gethsemane, where a tomb was located. Some traditions specify that it was the same tomb where Jesus' body had been laid after the crucifixion, before he rose again. The procession moved through Jerusalem, and according to legend, enemies of the Christians tried to stop them. A certain Jewish high priest named Jephonius wanted to overturn the bier carrying Mary's body, but the moment he reached out his hands, an angel cut them off with a sword. The hands remained hanging on the bier, and Jephonius fell to the ground in agony. Only when he repented and acknowledged Mary's holiness were his hands miraculously reattached. This is one of many dramatic episodes that adorn the tradition, emphasizing the holiness and protected status of the Mother of God even after death. The apostles placed the body in the tomb and sealed it. They remained nearby, continuing to pray. And here the most interesting thing happens. After 3 days, again a symbolic number reminiscent of Jesus' resurrection, the apostle Thomas arrived. He was late. According to one version, he was preaching so far away that he couldn't make it in time. According to another, he was deliberately delayed by God's will so that he would specifically witness the next miracle. Thomas was inconsolable. He begged the other apostles to open the tomb so he could at least say goodbye to Mary. The apostles initially resisted. The body had been buried for 3 days. They didn't want to disturb the peace. But Thomas insisted. Remember, this is the same apostle who doubted Jesus' resurrection and wanted to see the wounds to believe. and so they rolled the stone away from the entrance to the tomb, went inside, and the body was gone. Absolutely. Only the burial cloths remained there, emitting an incredible fragrance, but Mary herself was not there. What happened? According to tradition, on the third day, Jesus returned not only for the soul, but also for the body of his mother. He resurrected her, just as he had resurrected himself, and ascended her to heaven, now completely, with body and soul. Mary didn't just die. She transitioned from earthly life to heavenly life in a special state. This event came to be called the Dormition in the East and the Assumption in the West. Let's pause for a moment and realize how unusual this is. In Christian tradition, the resurrection of the dead is an event that is supposed to happen at the end of time, when Christ returns a second time. All the dead will rise and the righteous will receive new transformed bodies. But Mary, according to this tradition, did not wait for the end of time. She was taken to heaven, body and soul, even before the general resurrection. This places her in a completely special position among all the saints and righteous. Why is this important? Because it means that Mary is in heaven not just as a soul awaiting resurrection, but as a full-fledged person with a body capable of interceding for people before God. This is the theological basis for prayers to the Theotokos, God-bearer, which occupy such an important place in Catholic and Orthodox traditions. If Mary had died an ordinary death and her body had decayed in the earth like all people, her position would be entirely different. But how reliable is this story? Let's be honest. There is no historical evidence for Mary's assumption. There are no eyewitnesses whose testimony we could verify. There are no records from the 1st or 2nd century that confirm these events. There are only traditions that began to spread actively from the 4th century. Does this mean it's all made up? Not necessarily. Let's look at it from another angle. In the first centuries of Christianity, a great deal was transmitted orally. Written culture was expensive and not as widespread. Christian communities gathered together, shared stories, passed down teachings by word of mouth. The fact that the story of Mary's Dormition was not written down immediately does not mean it wasn't told. Moreover, the very fact that by the 4th century there were many versions of this story in different languages suggests that the tradition was widespread and deeply rooted. There is another interesting point. In the early church, there were disputes about many things: the nature of Christ, the Trinity, the dates of holidays. But practically no one disputed that something special happened to Mary after death. The disagreements were in the details, whether she died at all or was taken alive, how many days passed before the bodily assumption. But the fact of Mary's special departure was accepted by almost all branches of Christianity. Let's now talk about where exactly all this happened, because even on this point there is no consensus. We already mentioned that most traditions speak of Jerusalem, and indeed, in Jerusalem there is a place that has been venerated since ancient times as the site of Mary's Dormition. This is the church on Mount Zion, which contains a room traditionally considered to be the place where Mary spent her last days. Going down into the crypt, you see the spot where, according to tradition, her bed stood. But there is another tradition, especially common in the Western Church. According to it, Mary did not remain in Jerusalem after Jesus' ascension. Remember, Jesus from the cross entrusted her to the Apostle John? John, according to ancient sources, moved to Ephesus, a city in modern-day Turkey, and Mary went with him. Moreover, in the 19th century, a German nun named Anna Katharina Emmerich, who had never been to those parts, described in her visions a house where Mary lived in Ephesus. Based on her descriptions, an ancient house was indeed found on Mount Bulbul, near Ephesus. It is now a pilgrimage site, and many believe that this is where Mary spent her final years. Which version is correct? Historians are still debating. On one hand, there's a very ancient tradition linking Mary to Jerusalem. On the other, logic suggests that after Jesus' crucifixion, Jerusalem could have been a dangerous place for his mother, and moving to Ephesus under John's protection would make sense. Perhaps Mary lived in both places at different times. Or maybe the truth has long been lost in the depths of time, and we can only speculate. Be that as it may, both Jerusalem and Ephesus have tombs associated with Mary. In the Garden of Gethsemane in Jerusalem is the tomb of the Virgin Mary, an ancient cave where, according to tradition, the apostles laid Mary's body. When you descend the ancient steps into this tomb, you are surrounded by a special atmosphere. Thousands of candles, icons, the smell of incense. Orthodox, Catholics, Armenians, all hold services here. And although everyone believes that Mary's body did not remain in this tomb, the place itself is considered sacred as a witness to the miracle that occurred. Interestingly, archaeologists confirm that this tomb indeed dates to the 1st century, so it's not a later forgery, but a truly ancient burial site. Was Mary's body ever in it? Impossible to prove. But the fact that early Christians venerated this place, as evidenced by ancient inscriptions and graffiti, suggests that the tradition is very old. Now let's talk about how the Church officially regards this story. Because folk traditions and apocryphal texts are one thing, and official doctrine is another. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the path from ancient traditions to dogma was very long and difficult. In the Orthodox Church, the Feast of the Dormition of the Mother of God is celebrated on August 15th and is one of the 12 great feasts of the year. Orthodoxy has always recognized the special nature of Mary's departure from this world, but never made it a strict dogma. It is believed that Mary died, fell asleep, as the Orthodox say, using a softer word, but was then resurrected and taken to heaven. The details are not rigidly defined, and believers have some freedom in understanding how exactly it happened. In the Catholic Church, things are more interesting. The feast is also celebrated on August 15th, but it is called the Assumption of Mary. And here's what's surprising. It was only in 1950 that Pope Pius X proclaimed the dogma of the Assumption of Mary. This was one of the last dogmatic definitions in the history of the Catholic Church, and it caused considerable controversy. Why so late? Why did the Church need almost 2,000 years to officially recognize what millions of people had believed? The fact is that the Catholic Church is very cautious with dogmas. A dogma is a truth of faith considered to be divinely revealed and binding on all Catholics. A dogma can only be proclaimed when there is certainty that it is truly part of the apostolic tradition passed down from the apostles themselves. And the Church needed centuries to study all the sources, all the traditions before making a final statement. What exactly does the Catholic dogma say? Here is its essence. After the completion of her earthly life, Mary was assumed body and soul into heavenly glory. Note, the dogma does not state definitively whether Mary died before the Assumption or was taken alive. This is left open for theological discussion. The main point is that she is now in heaven completely, bodily, and this happened by a special grace of God due to her unique role as the Mother of God. For Catholics, this dogma is logically connected to another dogma, the Immaculate Conception of Mary, proclaimed in 1854. According to it, Mary was conceived without original sin. She was free from sin her entire life. And since death and decay are consequences of sin, it is natural for the sinless Mary not to undergo ordinary decay. Her body was to be preserved, resurrected, and glorified, like the body of her Son. Protestants view this quite differently. Most Protestant denominations reject both the dogma of the Immaculate Conception and the dogma of the Assumption. For them, these are non-biblical teachings added by the Church later. Protestants honor Mary as blessed among women, as the mother of Jesus, but do not ascribe to her a special status after death. They believe that Mary died an ordinary death, like all people, and awaits the general resurrection together with all the righteous. Who is right in this dispute? From the point of view of faith, each considers their own tradition to be right. From a historical point of view, we simply do not know for sure what happened to Mary. But it is important to understand why this question matters so much. It's not just about the fate of one person. It's about the nature of salvation, the victory over death, the hope of resurrection. The Assumption of Mary, body and soul, is essentially a foretaste of what awaits all believers. It is a sign that Christ's victory over death is real and complete. If Mary, an ordinary woman, albeit a holy one, could be resurrected and taken to heaven, then the same is possible for others. She becomes, as theologians say, the first of the saved, the first fruit of Christ's redemption. There is another important aspect to mention. The Assumption of Mary makes her accessible for prayer and intercession. Imagine, if her body lay in a tomb somewhere in the earth, and her soul resided in some intermediate state until the general resurrection, her ability to help the living would be limited. But if she is fully bodily present in heaven, next to her Son, then she can actively participate in the life of the church, hear prayers, intercede. This is precisely why the cult of the Virgin is so important in Catholic and Orthodox traditions. Millions of people turn to Mary in prayer daily. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of miraculous icons and statues of the Theotokos. There are many cases of Marian apparitions in Lourdes, Fatima, Guadalupe, and other places. And all these apparitions only make sense if Mary truly exists in heaven in the fullness of her person, capable of appearing and acting. Critics, of course, can say that all this is built on the shaky foundation of traditions that cannot be verified, and in a sense, they are right. But faith, by definition, is trust in what cannot be fully verified and proven. And for billions of Christians, the story of Mary's dormition and Assumption is not just a beautiful legend. It is part of a living tradition that connects them with the very first Christians who knew Mary personally. Let's now talk about how this story is reflected in art and culture, because few biblical themes have inspired artists as much as the dormition and Assumption of Mary. From the earliest centuries of Christianity to the present day, painters, sculptors, and writers have created works trying to depict this moment of transition between earth and heaven. One of the earliest depictions of the dormition is in the catacombs of Rome and dates to the 3rd or 4th century. It is a simple fresco depicting Mary on her deathbed, surrounded by apostles. Even here, in the very first images, we see the basic elements of iconography that would last for centuries. Mary lying on a bed, grieving apostles around her. Above her, Christ receiving her soul. As Christian art developed, the scene of the dormition became more complex and detailed. In Byzantine art, a classic iconography emerged. Christ stands in the center, holding in his hands a small figure, the soul of Mary, depicted as an infant in swaddling clothes. This is very symbolic. Mary gave birth to Christ into this world. Now Christ gives birth to her for eternal life. Around them are apostles in a state of grief and reverence. Above the whole scene, angels are often depicted, ready to receive the soul of the Mother of God. Western art of the Renaissance and Baroque focused more on the moment of the Assumption than on the death. Paintings by Titian, Rubens, and Caravaggio show Mary ascending to heaven in clouds, surrounded by angels. She is depicted as young, beautiful, in golden and blue robes, with hands folded in prayer or outstretched to heaven. Below, the apostles look up, pointing at the miracle. Some artists depicted the empty tomb with flowers inside, a symbol that the body did not decay but was taken up. One of the most impressive works is Titian's Assumption of the Virgin, a huge canvas in the Venetian church of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari. When you stand before this painting, you are literally captured by the dynamics of the composition. Mary surges upward with such force and energy that it seems she is about to break out of the frame. The red and gold tones create a feeling of divine light and glory. This is not a sad death scene. It is a triumph, a victory over death, a moment of absolute transfiguration. Interestingly, artists of different eras and cultures emphasize different aspects. Byzantine icons are more static and symbolic. They do not strive to show a realistic scene, but to convey a spiritual truth. Western Renaissance masters wanted the viewer to feel like a participant in the event, so their paintings are full of drama and emotion. And modern artists often return to simpler, more minimalist forms, trying to capture the essence of the event without excessive theatricality. But art is not only painting. The Dormition of Mary has been the theme of numerous literary works, musical compositions, and theatrical productions. In medieval Europe, mystery plays, theatrical performances on religious themes, were popular. The scene of the Dormition was one of the most beloved because it allowed for the depiction of both human drama, saying goodbye to a loved one, and the miracle, the appearance of Christ and the Assumption of Mary. Composers wrote majestic works for the Feast of the Assumption. Palestrina, Monteverdi, later Mozart and others created music that was meant to convey both the sorrow of loss and the joy of reunion and the grandeur of divine action. When you listen to these works, especially in the acoustics of ancient cathedrals, you begin to understand how music can become prayer, how sound can convey what cannot be expressed in words. In folk culture, the Feast of the Assumption also took a very important place. In Orthodox countries, it is one of the most significant summer holidays. It is preceded by a 2-week Dormition fast, a time of abstinence and prayer. On August 15th, people go to church, bring fruits and vegetables of the new harvest for blessing, especially apples, hence the folk name for the holiday, Apple Savior. After the service, festive meals are held, relatives are visited, and the deceased are remembered. In Catholic countries, especially in Spain, Italy, and Latin America, the Feast of the Assumption is celebrated with particular splendor. Processions with statues of the Virgin are held, carried through the streets of cities and villages. People decorate the streets with flowers, sing hymns, set off fireworks. It is a day of joy, not sorrow, because the emphasis is not on death, but on the Assumption, the victory over death. There are also many folk traditions and beliefs associated with this day. In some regions, it was believed that on the Feast of the Assumption, heaven opens and prayers reach God especially quickly. Young girls told fortunes about their future husbands, the sick asked for healing, travelers prayed for protection on the road. Peasants believed that the weather on the Assumption predicted the weather for the autumn. As the day is, so will the autumn be. All this shows how deeply Mary's story has entered the culture and daily life of people. It is not just a religious teaching detached from life. It is a living tradition that shapes the calendar, determines the rhythm of the year, gives people a reason to gather, remember important things, pray, and celebrate. But let's return to historical questions. We talked about traditions and dogmas, but are there any objective historical testimonies about the last years of Mary's life? What do historians and archaeologists say? Can we know anything for sure? Unfortunately, direct historical evidence is very scarce. Mary was not a public figure. She was not a preacher, did not write epistles, did not lead communities. She lived quietly in the shadow of the great events associated with her son. Therefore, contemporaries did not consider it necessary to record the details of her life. In their understanding, Jesus was important, his teachings, his church. Mary was important as his mother, but her own story seemed secondary. The first mentions of special veneration of Mary appear in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. For example, there's a text called the Proto-Evangelium of James, written in the 2nd century, which tells of Mary's birth and childhood, her presentation in the temple, the Annunciation, and the birth of Jesus. But even there, the story breaks off at the flight into Egypt. Nothing about the last years of her life. Only in the 4th century, when Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire and active construction of churches on holy sites began, do attempts to localize events associated with Mary appear. The Byzantine Empress Eudocia in the 5th century built a church in Gethsemane on the site of Mary's supposed tomb. This indicates that the tradition of Mary's burial in Gethsemane already existed and was authoritative enough. Around the same time, Bishop Juvenal of Jerusalem at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 spoke about Mary's tomb in Gethsemane and that it was found empty. This is one of the earliest written mentions of Mary's assumption by a church authority. But even Bishop Juvenal spoke of tradition, not events he could personally verify. Interestingly, archaeological excavations in Gethsemane do confirm the presence of an ancient first-century necropolis there. The tomb now venerated as Mary's tomb in its structure and age could well have been a burial site at that time, but proving that Mary was specifically buried there is impossible. There are no inscriptions, no artifacts that would unequivocally point to this. The same can be said about Mary's house in Ephesus. Archaeologists confirm that the found structure does date to the 1st century and shows signs that Christians lived there, remains of a small chapel, crosses, traces of veneration of the site. But again, there is no direct evidence that Mary specifically lived there. So what are we left with? We are left with tradition. We are left with an unbroken chain of testimonies that Christians from the earliest times believed in Mary's special fate after her earthly life. We are left with thousands of pilgrims who for 1,500 years have come to these places, prayed there, left records of miracles and healings. We are left with the faith of billions of people for whom Mary's story is not just a historical event, but a living reality, part of their spiritual experience. And here we come to a very important point. The story of Mary's Dormition is a story on the border between history and faith, between fact and meaning. Can it be proven as a historical fact? No. Can it be disproven? Also no. It exists in a special space of religious experience where proofs are less important than significance, not so much what literally happened, but what it means for believers. Let's consider this with a concrete example. Imagine a woman named Elena who lives in a small town somewhere in Greece. Her life is not easy. She lost her husband, is raising 2 children alone, works 2 jobs to make ends meet. Every day is a struggle, fatigue, anxiety. And on August 15th, she goes to church for the Feast of the Dormition. She stands before the icon of the Theotokos, listens to the story familiar since childhood about how Mary went through all the trials of life, poverty, misunderstanding, the loss of her son, and was ultimately received into the heavenly kingdom. For Elena, this is not an abstract theological concept. It is a living message of hope. If Mary, a simple woman from Nazareth who went through such suffering, was glorified and assumed in the end, then there is hope for her, for Elena. Her pain and struggle are not meaningless. There is a perspective, a promise that all this will lead to something greater, that death is not the end, that love is stronger than suffering. This is the key significance of Mary's story. It makes the hope of Christianity concrete, tangible. The resurrection of Christ is majestic and grand, but it can seem distant. Christ was the Son of God. He performed miracles. He was special. But Mary? Mary was an ordinary woman. Yes, she was chosen for a special mission, but she was not a goddess, not a superhuman. She got tired, cried, was afraid, suffered. And if she could go through all that and reach heaven, then it is possible for everyone. This is precisely why Mary became such an important figure in Christian spirituality, especially for women. Throughout the centuries, when women were largely excluded from the official church hierarchy, Mary was for them an image of female dignity, strength, and holiness. She was proof that a woman could be not just a passive vessel, but an active participant in the plan of salvation. But Mary's story is important not only for women, it is important for anyone facing loss, grief, misunderstanding. Mary lost her son in the worst possible sense. She saw him killed before her eyes. There is no greater grief for a mother. And yet, she did not become bitter, did not lose faith, did not turn away from God. She continued to pray, continued to love, continued to hope, and in the end, her faithfulness was rewarded. This is a powerful message for anyone going through a dark valley of suffering. Mary's story says, hold on, keep believing, keep loving, even when everything seems hopeless. Because in the end, darkness will be defeated, death will be overcome, and there will be a meeting, a reunion, joy. Let's now talk about how Mary's story influenced the development of Christian theology in general. Because, strangely enough, the debate surrounding the figure of Mary, her dormition and assumption, touched upon the most fundamental questions of the Christian faith. One of the main questions is the nature of salvation. Is a person saved by faith alone, as Protestants teach? Or does salvation also require good works, human cooperation with grace, as Catholics and Orthodox teach? Mary became a key figure in this debate. For Catholics and Orthodox, Mary is the example of perfect cooperation with God. She did not just passively accept God's will at the Annunciation. She actively said yes. She freely agreed to become the mother of the Savior, though she could have refused. And throughout her life, she continued this cooperation through obedience, faith, love. Her assumption into heaven, from this point of view, is not simply a mercy of God granted to a passive object. It is the crown of a life lived in full union with God's will. Mary merited this not in the sense of earned, as if salvation could be bought with good deeds, but in the sense that her life was open to the action of grace, and grace transformed her completely. Protestants object to this understanding, fearing that it diminishes the role of Christ and his sacrifice. For them, salvation is exclusively the work of Christ, and any emphasis on the role of Mary or the saints risks diverting attention from the only Savior. Therefore, they prefer to see Mary simply as a blessed woman who was honored to become the mother of Jesus, but who thereafter plays no special role in the history of salvation. These different approaches reflect deeper differences in understanding the relationship between God and humanity. For Catholics and Orthodox, God does not simply save a person unilaterally, like a fireman pulling an unconscious victim from a burning house. Salvation is a dialogue, a relationship in which the person is called to actively participate. Mary is the perfect example of such participation. Another important theological question is the question of the body and matter. Early Christianity arose in a culture heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, which often contrasted spirit and matter, considering the body a prison for the soul. Some early Christian heresies, such as Gnosticism, rejected matter as evil and claimed that salvation was the liberation of the spirit from the body. The Church resolutely rejected such views. Christianity affirms the value of the material world, the value of the body. After all, God himself became flesh in the person of Jesus. The resurrection of Christ was not simply a resurrection of the spirit, but a resurrection of the body. And the promise of Christianity is not a bodiless existence of spirits, but the resurrection of the dead, new heavens and a new earth, a transformed material world. The assumption of Mary, body and soul, emphasizes this truth. If her body had remained in the earth and decayed, it could have been interpreted as meaning that the body is unimportant, that ultimately only the spirit is saved. But the assumption with the body says, no, the body is important, matter is important, God saves the whole person, not just his soul. This is a victory over dualistic thinking, an affirmation of the integrity of the human person. There's another aspect, a feminist one, if you will. In recent decades, some theologians, especially women, have noted that Mary's assumption is the only case in Christian tradition where a female body is explicitly glorified and placed in heavenly glory. For centuries, the female body in religious discourse was associated with temptation, sin, weakness. But Mary overturns this narrative. Her body, a female body that carried and gave birth to the Savior, is recognized as so holy and valuable that it could not be left to decay. This does not mean that the Catholic or Orthodox churches have become feminist in the modern sense, but it shows that at the very heart of the Christian tradition, There are seeds of a more positive attitude towards the feminine principle, the female body, and female experience. And Mary's story is the key to unlocking these seeds. Now, let's talk about modernity. How is Mary's story, a story 2,000 years old, relevant today in the 21st century? Why do millions of people continue to be interested in it, celebrate her dormition, pray to her? One reason is that in our world, full of instability, anxiety, and change, people are looking for something constant, reliable, rooted in deep tradition. Mary's story is a connection to the past, to the very origins of Christianity, to the people and events that changed the course of history. When you celebrate the Dormition today, you are doing the same thing Christians did 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, and 100 years ago. This creates a sense of continuity, belonging to something greater than your own small life. Another reason is that the figure of Mary provides comfort and hope in suffering. We live in a world where suffering has not disappeared. People continue to lose loved ones, get sick, face injustice, experience crises. And in such moments, knowing that there is someone who understands, who herself went through terrible suffering and survived, who can sympathize and help, is incredibly valuable. A third reason is the apparitions of Mary, which continue to be reported in different parts of the world. Lourdes, Fatima, Medjugorje, Guadalupe are just the most famous places where, according to testimony, the Virgin Mary has appeared. But there are hundreds of less-known cases, and each such apparition, if recognized by the Church or at least attracting the attention of believers, revives faith that Mary is not just a historical figure, but a living, actively present reality. Skeptics, of course, explain these apparitions by psychological factors, mass hallucinations, people's desire to see miracles. And in some cases, they are probably right. The Church itself is very strict about claims of miracles and apparitions, checks them for years, and rejects most as unreliable. But there remain cases that are difficult to explain purely rationally. For example, the healings at Lourdes, which were documented by the Medical Bureau and have no scientific explanation, or the miracle of the sun at Fatima in 1917, witnessed by tens of thousands of people, including journalists and skeptics. Whatever the cause of these apparitions, the fact remains. They have a real effect. People travel to these places as pilgrims, pray, and many claim to receive comfort, healing, spiritual renewal. Lourdes receives about 6 million pilgrims a year. This is not just tourism. These are people seeking an encounter with something greater than ordinary reality. And Mary's story, the story of a woman who was assumed into heaven and can now appear to people and help them, gives context and meaning to such searches. Another modern aspect is how the image of Mary is adapted to different cultures. When Christianity came to Latin America, Mary became Our Lady of Guadalupe, appearing to the indigenous Juan Diego with the face of a mestiza, in garments combining Spanish and local elements. In Africa, Mary is often depicted with dark skin in traditional African attire. In Asia, there are images of Mary in the style of Buddhist or Hindu iconography. This shows the amazing flexibility and universality of Mary's image. She is not rigidly tied to one culture or ethnic group. Every nation can see in her something of its own, close, native. And at the same time, she remains the same Mary of Nazareth, the mother of Jesus, a first-century woman. This ability to be simultaneously a specific historical person and a universal symbol of motherhood, suffering, hope, and love is perhaps one of the reasons for her enduring popularity. In our time, when many traditional religious structures are in crisis, when churches are emptying in Europe and North America, interest in Mary often remains strong, even among those who have distanced themselves from institutional religion. People who do not go to church regularly may still light a candle before an icon of the Theotokos in a difficult moment. Those who doubt the church's dogmas may still feel a connection to Mary as a maternal figure, a source of comfort. This suggests that Mary speaks to something very deep in the human psyche. Perhaps it is the archetype of the mother, present in all cultures and religions. Perhaps it is the need for a feminine aspect of the divine, which is lacking in traditional Christian theology with its emphasis on God the Father and God the Son. Perhaps it is simply the human need for someone who understands, sympathizes, cares without judgment or conditions. Critics of Marian spirituality, and they exist even within Christianity, warn of the danger that Mary may overshadow Christ, that the veneration of Mary may turn into a kind of paganism, a cult of the mother goddess incompatible with monotheism. These concerns are not unfounded. In popular religiosity, one can sometimes indeed see the figure of Mary becoming more important, closer, more accessible than the figure of Christ or God the Father. But defenders of Marian spirituality respond that Mary never claims independent divinity. All her power and significance come from her relationship with Christ. She is a path to Christ, not a replacement for Christ. She is a mediator, but not the source of salvation. And her very assumption is not her own achievement, but a gift from God, the result of her Son's redemptive action. These debates will likely continue as long as Christianity exists. But the very fact that they continue, that people passionately argue about Mary's role, the meaning of her dormition, the permissibility of her veneration, shows that the topic is alive, relevant, and stirring. Let's now try to draw some conclusions. What have we learned about the death and assumption of Mary? What of this is reliable history, and what is legend and faith? Here is what we know with reasonable certainty. Mary was a real historical person, the mother of Jesus of Nazareth. She lived in the 1st century in Palestine. After the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, she remained for some time in Jerusalem with the apostles. Then her trace is lost in historical documents. Here is what is tradition, but stable and ancient tradition. Mary lived for several more years after Jesus' ascension. She died, or fell asleep, as the Orthodox prefer to say, surrounded by the apostles. Her death was not ordinary. She was taken to heaven, body and soul, to be with her Son. Here is what is a dogma of faith for Catholics and a stable belief for Orthodox. Mary is now in heaven in the fullness of her person, body, and soul. She does not await the general resurrection at the end of time like all other people. She has already been resurrected and assumed. Here is what is a matter of theological debate. Did Mary die before the Assumption, or was she taken alive? How much time exactly passed between death and the bodily Assumption? Where exactly did she spend her last years? In Jerusalem or Ephesus? And here is what remains a mystery that cannot be resolved by historical or scientific methods. Did Mary's Assumption occur in the literal physical sense described by the traditions? Or is it a symbolic way of expressing a spiritual truth about her special status? For a believing person, the answer to the last question is generally unequivocal. Yes, it happened really. God, who raised Jesus from the dead, is quite capable of resurrecting and assuming Mary. For him, it's not a problem. And if he decided to honor the mother of his Son in this way, it makes sense. It corresponds to the logic of faith. For a skeptic, the answer will be different. It's a beautiful legend created by pious Christians to honor the memory of a woman they respected. It reflects their ideas about holiness, victory over death, motherhood, and femininity. But as a historical fact, it is unprovable and possibly unreliable. But there is a third position worth considering. Perhaps the question, did this happen literally, is not the most important question. Perhaps it is more important to ask, what truth is expressed in this story? What does it tell us about human nature, the meaning of life and death, the possibility of transformation? The story of Mary's Assumption says, death does not have the final word. The body is not just a discarded shell, it is valuable and can be transfigured. Suffering is not meaningless, it can lead to glory. An ordinary person living in faith and love can reach incredible heights. Motherhood is not just a biological function, but a sacred calling. A woman can be a bearer of the divine. All these truths do not depend on whether the stone was really rolled away from the tomb in Gethsemane on a specific day in the 1st century. They work on the level of meaning, symbol, spiritual reality. And for billions of people over 2,000 years, these truths have been and remain vitally important. Mary's story is a story of hope. In a world full of death and suffering, it is a promise that there is something beyond, that love is stronger than death, that faithfulness is rewarded, that there is someone who cares for us and understands our suffering, because she herself went through it. It is also a story about the dignity of ordinary people. Mary was not a queen, not a scholar, not a rich woman. She was a simple girl from a backwater town, and she was chosen for the greatest role in the history of salvation. This tells each of us, your life can have enormous significance regardless of your social status or education. What seems small and insignificant can be the beginning of something great. The story of Mary's Assumption is also a story about the body and matter. In an age when we often neglect our bodies, abuse them, or conversely, are obsessed with their appearance in a superficial sense, this story reminds us the body is sacred. It is not the enemy of the spirit, but its partner. It is capable of bearing the divine and being transfigured in glory. And finally, it is a story about motherhood, not in a sentimental greeting card sense, but in a deep, existential one. Mary gave life to Christ, but it cost her pain, the pain of childbirth, the pain of watching her son suffer and die. Motherhood in this story is not romanticized. It is shown as a vocation requiring everything: body, heart, soul. And it is the fullness of this gift that makes Mary worthy of the Assumption. So, in the end, did the Virgin Mary die? Yes, in the sense that her earthly life ended. But no, in the sense that death did not conquer her. According to the faith of billions of Christians, she lives, fully, bodily, in transfigured glory in heaven. And the story of her dormition and Assumption continues to live in the hearts of believers, in the feasts of the church, in works of art, in the prayers rising to her every day all over the world. Do we know all the details of what happened in those distant days of the 1st century? No. Are there elements of legend and pious imagination in this story? Almost certainly. But does this negate the value and significance of this story? Not at all. Because the great stories of humanity, stories that shape cultures, inspire generations, give meaning to life, are not necessarily stories that can be confirmed in a laboratory or a court of law. They are stories that speak to our heart, our imagination, our deepest need for meaning and hope. And if you go into any Catholic or Orthodox church in the world today, you will see candles burning before the image of the Theotokos. You will see people whispering prayers, perhaps with tears in their eyes. You will see flowers brought as gifts. And in this simple act of reverence lives the same faith that lived in the hearts of the first Christians 2,000 years ago. Faith that Mary will hear, understand, help. Faith that her story is not just a story, but a living reality that continues to touch people's lives here and now. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring this amazing and multifaceted story. If you enjoyed this video, if you learned something new or looked at a familiar story in a new way, please like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment. I'm always happy to hear your thoughts, your questions, your own experience and understanding of these topics. Perhaps you have your own story related to Mary, a pilgrimage experience, a prayer that was answered, simply a moment of comfort before an icon. Share it in the comments. Or maybe you have questions, doubts, other views on what we discussed. That is also important and valuable, because these great themes of life, death, faith, hope, they deserve to be talked about, reflected upon, debated. In future videos, we will continue to explore little-known and amazing stories from the Christian tradition, Stories of saints, miracles, mysterious events that shaped the faith of millions of people. Because behind familiar images and rituals often lie incredible, dramatic, human stories worth knowing. For now, remember, regardless of your beliefs, regardless of whether you perceive Mary's story as a literal fact, a symbolic truth, or a beautiful legend, there is a message in it that is relevant to each of us. Life is full of suffering, but suffering does not have the final word. Love is stronger than death, and even the simplest person living with an open heart can reach incredible heights. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and remember, whatever your story is, it is important, it matters, and it is not over yet. See you in the next video.